Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today is the third segment of the Cayenne Shift episode, where you can see me stick shifting through New York City in my Porsche Cayenne, a 2006 model that came equipped with a manual transmission. So I wanted to make this sort of like a buyer's guide and what to look for when searching for this type of vehicle. So, first things first, this is a manual transmission car. It is relatively rare. There were not many made. This was basically the dealership special, which allowed the dealerships all across the country to place this car under the $50,000 segment because the Tiptronic transmission was a expensive option, to say the least. I just had to recently watch for someone who accelerated up to the stop sign, because that's a reality of driving in New York. A lot of people go crazy trying to beat the stop sign or trying to cut you off in the middle of traffic. It's a New York reality. When looking for a Porsche Cayenne, you have to understand the models. You have the V6 variants as well as the 8-cylinder variants. When this car debuted in the United States, it was offered as an S model, a turbo model, and then eventually came the 6-cylinder base model. The Lamborghini Urus of today is considered one of the fastest SUVs out in the marketplace. That was the Porsche Cayenne back in 2004 when it was brought over for the first time. It was considered the performance SUV. It was the upper echelon of what SUV performance was, with a 0 to 60 time of 4.5 seconds coming from the turbo and 4.9 seconds coming from the S model under strict testing conditions. These are reported numbers. Porsche gave specific numbers and independent testers confirmed even lower numbers, because Porsche is very conservative with their performance numbers. And then the 6-cylinder model came later. But the unique situation was that there was not a manual transmission offered with the initial offerings of the Porsche Cayenne. So what that allowed was the VR6 model to debut with a manual transmission. But people were opting for a V8 model to also offer the type of performance that you could get with a manual transmission, because they wanted to have a more engaging experience. So what Porsche did was, for the 2008 model year, they had for the first time offered the 8-cylinder model with a manual transmission, and that model is the GTS, a highly coveted, very rare model that you could find on Bring a Trailer or other avenues in which you look for cars. But Bring a Trailer is probably your best bet, because that's where they have the curated type of format to allow for the best car with the best history and the lowest mileage. So the GTS, in the end, and the base 6-cylinder model, the one that I'm driving right now, were the only two Porsches ever offered with a manual transmission. And the rest of the lineup, the S model, the turbo model, were always standard with an automatic transmission. Another thing to consider when looking for one of these cars is to make sure you get a car, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, to get a car with and shock spring setup. The air suspension at this time was probably a more compliant ride. It was a more comfortable ride. However, you always ran into problems when it came to servicing an air suspension, because the R-Knot air suspension, I know with Mercedes-Benz, my mechanic complains about servicing the system and the expense that is incurred with that type of system, and it just leads to multiple problems. So your best bet is to get a more conservative shock and spring setup. It's easy to replace, and it offers an easy swap for a shock and spring setup, in case you ever want to convert to coilovers and really intensify the performance of your car. The Volkswagen VR6. It was an engine that was shared with the Volkswagen Touareg because it was built on the same assembly line. And the Touareg and the Porsche Cayenne of this generation, as well as the Audi Q7, all share many parts, such as the braking systems. Even the rear doors swap right into a Porsche Cayenne. Now the VR6 is a very reliable power plant. It is my choice. It was my choice to get the VR6 engine because this was a car that I was going to use every single day in New York City traffic. It was going to be stop and go traffic, and I was never going to have any Autobahn-like experiences with this car. The only time I ever take the highway is to go visit my sister in Pittsburgh or visit family members out of state, and I never need to exceed the speed limit in order to get to those places. So for me, it just made practical sense to get the VR6, but I did want to spice it up a little bit by having a manual transmission. The manual just made it a little bit more engaging and a little bit more fun. And it was an opportunity for me to practice my heel and toeing. So that was the reason I got the manual transmission, because I wanted to have more experience with a manual transmission moving forward with any type of car that I decide to get after this. Now the V8 is a wonderful model. I have a friend who actually has and owns a GTS model, and he absolutely loves the GTS. He's never had to do any engine rebuilds or anything of that nature, but he does have to take it in for service on a much more frequent basis than I ever have to. For me, this is like servicing a standard issue, run-of-the-mill Volkswagen. It is really that simple to swipe over the coils, change my own spark plugs. It is something that does not take much effort if I wanted to actually perform these duties on my own. And this is a car that I can drive every day, which makes it easy to maintain. Now when it comes to maintenance, I do have to note that this thing is very heavy. So because it is very heavy, it does run through brakes every 10,000 miles, no matter what I do. No matter how conservative I am with the gas pedal, no matter how slow I drive, I can't defy the laws of physics when it comes to this car. Because whenever you have something that has a lot of mass and you're trying to bring it to a stop, when you're trying to decelerate, you're gonna run through brake pads like there's no tomorrow. That is my only complaint about the car, because brake pads are not cheap on this car. But besides that, the thing runs great. I mean, if I really do need to come to a stop, the brakes on a Porsche are world-renowned. I mean, it set the benchmark for braking. So Porsche knows a few things about braking, considering their 19 wins at Le Mans. And this is a vehicle that I enjoy very much. Now, when I think about the suspension of this vehicle, the suspension is a shock and spring setup. But one thing that aids in the suspension, which in my opinion, I've driven the 8-cylinder model, and I think about the 6-cylinder model, a V6 weighs considerably less than a V8. So, in my opinion, because it has less weight over the front axle, I'm going to argue that the 6-cylinder handles a lot better than the 8-cylinder model when it's at speed. Now, the 6-cylinder may take a longer time to get up to speed, but the 8-cylinder model gets up there to speed, but the 6-cylinder model will actually handle the corners and maintain its speed. So I really enjoy the way the thing handles. I enjoy the way it brakes. And because it has a manual transmission, I really like the way I'm engaged with the acceleration. So I'm going to argue that the 6-cylinder model with the 6-speed manual transmission is the best, most reliable car that Porsche offers. And it's also the cheapest one, because Cayennes are relatively cheap. If you go on Craigslist right now, you can get a Cayenne for about $5,000. Now, if you're looking for a manual transmission, it's a different story. But if you want reliability on a daily driver, and you want the history and the heritage of Porsche, you really can't go wrong with the 6-cylinder Cayenne. One of the most expensive maintenance items that I've had to do with this car, that is a common problem with a lot of these Porsche Cayennes, is the drive shaft, the replacement of the drive shaft. That is one thing that most buyers complain about when getting these cars. The drive shaft is probably a $900 item, and it is not cheap and it's not easy to replace because many parts have to come off from the underside of the vehicle. So it requires the balancing and installation of an experienced mechanic, someone who services European vehicles exclusively. And the luck is that this problem also occurs with the Volkswagen Touareg of the same generation and the Audi Q7. So it is not something that is unique to only Porsche. It is a problem of the Volkswagen group in general. Another reason why the 6-cylinder is easier to maintain than the 8-cylinder variants of the S and the Turbo. The 8 cylinders of this generation had crossover coolant pipes that were made out of plastic from the factory. So one of the major recall items early in its life cycle was the installation of aluminum crossover coolant pipes, which increased the maintenance life and it increased the life of the engine. So it's important to get this modification done if it already has not been done. So getting the crossover coolant pipes taken care of extends the life of the engine, and if it doesn't get done, you run the risk. It's like the equivalent of the IMS bearing with the 996 and first generation 997 911s. It's important to get this maintenance item done, this recall item, because it could lead to an engine rebuild or permanent engine failure. And it has been documented on Renlist and other places where you can find information about the Porsche Cayenne engine. You would have to do a complete engine swap, which is definitely not cheap and definitely not optimal. It's not something that you want to do because it takes away not only from the experience of owning the car, but it also takes away from the value of the car because it's no longer a number matching item. Not that that really matters with Porsche owners for the most part, because some of my favorite Porsches have engine swaps. Basically like a 911 getting installed into a Cayman body. But nonetheless, if you want to avoid and maintain cheap Porsche ownership, which is what I'm about, because I like driving my cars and I like driving them every day, it's best to identify what those recall items are. And even if it's past its deadline, it's important to just get it done if you just want to keep your car going. So that's the conclusion of my video. I had a great time filming it, talking about this car, talking about the ins and outs of ownership, and what it generally costs me to replace brakes, which I can't actually cite the price right now, but if you go to any mechanic, they'll tell you that the brakes on a Porsche are not cheap. But that's the conclusion of my ideas and my thoughts, no one else's. So if you enjoy my video, please subscribe, please like, and I look forward to these one-on-one videos where I'm talking to a camera. So if you're watching this on a Friday, enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.